Most of us have played Risk as a kid. If you have not had this pleasure, it is a more overtly violent game in the spirit of Monopoly when it comes to alienating friends and family using armies instead of money. Games usually end up teaching younger siblings more about swearing and strategy as they draw a 40 army placement card and roll over their competition based entirely on good dice rolls. In 2020, a new version came out, and millions of people really got attached to the concept. You may have heard people talking in terms of minimal risk or my own risk. Those are people who are especially eager to play and spend a lot of time online debating various rules and strategies. You can engage them the customary way, like coughing or sneezing, in a way that they can't ignore. As the name implies, the new game board is really simplified from the original, and some people play without it entirely because the spaces are pretty easy to remember. The first thing to set up is the environment, and there are tons of alternative rules here. If you find the original game boring, there are some really wild possibilities out there on Twitter and Facebook. You'll have to do your own research on those, but we started this tutorial with the rulebook recommended viral load of 10 pieces in the environment. It's also worth noting that the rules have really evolved over time. Turns out that the fervent community interaction was not really anticipated. The popularity of posting alternative environment scenarios to see who can start with a more disadvantaged position and believe they can really still win the game became a driver for increased levels of play. In fact, new alternative strategies like ivermectin popped up all the time and continue to expand the player base nearly 2 years after the initial release. Without going down too many rabbit holes, for the first year, the most popular environment mods were social distancing and masking. These cut down on the viral load in the setup phase, but it turns out that a lot of people were just not comfortable with them. Those players helped playtest the Delta variant, which essentially makes distancing and masking obsolete if you are in the same enclosed space. Anyway, there are lots of different ways to get this started, and you'll have to decide which one is right for you and your family before you start the game for the first time. One last point before continuing to the tutorial. Veteran players have a completely different setup, but for the tutorial, we'll cover that a little bit later. For now, we're just going to cover the novice version so you can see what playing your first game might actually look like. In the early game, the goal is to maintain control of the respiratory space. The player has 2 sentries that show up every round. These are the only pieces that start in that space. First move is always the same. After viral load has been settled, move some amount of invaders into the respiratory space and battle with the sentries. When sentries lose a battle, they are placed on their side and moved to the lymphatic space. The next turn is the player, who probably only has 2 dead sentries on the first turn. For each used up sentry, roll a d6. If the player rolls a 6, they can create 1 soldier. These little babies are the key to victory, and whatever you have in your lymphatic space has to make it all the way across the board. In this version of the game, getting those early 6s can be the difference between winning and losing. At the end of the player's turn, place 2 new sentries on respiratory. At the beginning of the invader's turn, and from here out, double the number of pieces in respiratory and vascular spaces. They can attack as you would expect into adjacent spaces, or if this is a multiplayer game, some of the pieces can be moved back into the environment to attack the next player as well. First, resolve the conflict in respiratory space between the invaders and the sentries. At least 10 invaders need to be left in any space to hold it, so moving from respiratory to vascular requires at least 11 invaders holding respiratory after sentries have been defeated. For novice players, you can expect invaders to reach the vascular space fairly quickly, as there are no soldiers here. Now, one strategy that you can employ is to collect a vaccine card. These come out of a promised expansion that was not available when the game first launched. Getting these into the public's arms has, frankly, been really bungled by the distributors, even though they are supposed to be free. They should be fairly easy to get these days, but globally there are still some spots you may not be able to get your hands on one. Anyway, this card puts an extra sentry in your vascular space, along with 3 soldiers in vascular and lymphatic. As a side note, I don't know where lymphatic is on the map, but it seems like somewhere in South America because their starting economy is terrible. I'm glad I have my own vaccine card to help address this, even though a few people claim it isn't OP enough, and some fringe purists say the rules on the card are entirely misprinted, but I digress. As invaders reach the vascular space, they gain a strategic buffer for pushing them out of respiratory. You'll need a lot of higher order piece markers here, because the invaders are quickly going to number in the hundreds if you haven't been able to roll a 6 with all your massacred sentries. Once there are 100 invaders in the respiratory space, the game is normally over, and the player loses. However, a special respiratory mod called Ventilator can be played to move the victory condition to 250 pieces. Honestly, I don't know why this rule exists because it seems to just prolong the game without really changing the victory conditions. Just to spice things up, I recommend the Deep South rule here. If you roll a 1 on a d6, there just isn't a ventilator available for this phase of the game, and it's over. At least this mixes it up a bit rather than assuming the game will just drag on and on. On the player side of the board, each soldier in the lymphatic space generates 6 additional soldiers at the beginning of their turn. However, if you don't engage enemies in vascular and respiratory spaces, the invaders can entirely shut the game down or take over bonus spaces like cognition and purple toes. Since the invaders have to hold all the bonus spaces to reach their alternative victory condition, these areas are usually ignored by the most common strategies. If you manage to win your first game, you gain veteran status, and that allows you the special game board setup we talked about earlier. I've gone ahead and set that up for you here. This is, frankly, more powerful than using a vaccine card due to some residual soldiers starting in the respiratory space. But like vaccine, it is still no guarantee that you can hold the respiratory space against all future starting conditions. Oh, and I almost forgot. If you don't win the first game, you don't get to play anymore. This is a really unfortunate rule, but we have all been forced to abide by it. I guess that's why I felt compelled to make this tutorial and lay out some of the better strategy options, so you can impress your Facebook friends by winning your first match of minimal risk.